Okay, so today we're diving into a book that's had a profound impact on me, Man's Search for Meaning.
Oh, absolutely. It's
Yeah.
one of those books that really stays with you.
It's intense, right? I mean, Viktor Frankl's experiences in the Nazi concentration camps, it's heavy stuff. But the way he finds meaning even in the midst of that suffering, it's incredible.
It's interesting you say that because Frankl himself didn't want to write just another account of the atrocities.
Right.
He wanted to go deeper, explore the psychology of survival.
Yeah, and he does that by sharing his own experiences, but also by focusing on the experiences of the average prisoner.
Exactly. He even says in the preface he wanted to highlight those everyday torments, the things that wore down the spirit just as much as the physical suffering.
So we're not just getting a historical account here, we're getting a glimpse into the human psyche under unimaginable pressure. We're working with excerpts from the book, by the way, including the preface and the beginning of Experiences in a Concentration Camp.
And those prefaces, they're so powerful on their own, even before you get into the main text.
Totally. Okay, so before we dive deeper, can you give our listeners a little background on Frankl himself? I know he was a psychiatrist.
Yeah, he was a professor of neurology and psychiatry in Vienna before the war, and he actually founded his own school of psychotherapy, which he called logotherapy.
Logotherapy, right?
And that's all about finding meaning in life, isn't it?
Exactly. And it's so fascinating because his experiences in the camps directly shaped his theories. Which makes sense when you think about it. I mean, if anyone had a reason to give up on hope, it was those who were imprisoned. But Frankl saw firsthand that those who clung to some sense of meaning, even if it was just a tiny flicker, were often the ones who found the strength to survive.
Absolutely. And he talks about this one prisoner who found meaning in the thought of reuniting with his wife.
Heartbreaking.
It was,
Yeah.
but it gave him a reason to keep going, even when everything else was stripped away.
It's a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit, but I think to really understand this, we need to go deeper into the reality of camp life.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Because it wasn't just about enduring physical hardship, was it? It was the psychological torture, the constant dehumanization, the feeling of utter hopelessness.
It's hard to even fathom. And Frankl describes it so vividly, the different phases the prisoners went through, the psychological defenses they erected just to cope with the horrors they were witnessing.
Right, and I think understanding those phases is key to grasping the power of his insights. So where do we even begin?
Well, it all starts with that initial shock of arrival.
Okay, so let's start there.
I mean, just imagine you're ripped from your life, stripped of your identity, thrown into this chaotic, terrifying new world.
It's almost impossible to comprehend.
Right. And the first thing that hits you is this utter disbelief. Like, this
Yeah.
can't be happening. This isn't real.
Denial.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the reality of it, the brutality, the constant threat of death, it starts to sink in. And that's when the psychological defenses kick in.
And one of the first ones he talks about is apathy, right?
Yeah. Like a numbness sets in. He even calls it a cultural hibernation.
Cultural hibernation. Wow. What does that look like exactly?
Basically, everything that we associate with being human, with having a rich inner life, it goes dormant. Art, music, intellectual curiosity. It all takes a backseat to the immediate needs of survival.
It's like their emotions shut down as a way to cope with the overwhelming horror of it all.
Right. And Frankl noticed that the prisoners had a hard time engaging in anything that went beyond the immediate necessities of survival.
Did he mention any exceptions to that?
He did. He said there were two main areas where prisoners still showed some flicker of their old selves: politics and religion.
Interesting. Why those two, do you think?
Well, politics represented the outside world, the war, the possibility of liberation. Even if it was just based on rumors and whispers, it gave them something to hope for.
A glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel?
Exactly. And religion, well, that offered solace, a connection to something larger than themselves.
A reason to believe in a future beyond the camps. It's like clinging to any shred of hope, any sense that there's a world out there that still makes sense.
Exactly. And that hope, that belief in something beyond the barbed wire, could make all the difference.
And speaking of clinging to hope, he talks about this one scene where a transport of prisoners is passing through Vienna, Frankl's hometown, and he can actually see his childhood streets through a tiny peephole in the train car.
I remember that passage. It's so poignant.
It's heartbreaking. He begs the other prisoners to let him stand in front of the people for just a moment to reconnect with that lost world, but they're completely indifferent.
It's like the trauma of the camps has severed their connection to their former lives, almost to the point of cruelty.
It's a stark illustration of how the camps warped their sense of reality. The world outside, with its everyday concerns and joys, must have seemed almost unimaginable to them.
And I think that speaks to the depths of their suffering, to be so broken that you lose your connection to the things that once gave you joy.
It's hard to even imagine. And that survival often came down to the most agonizing choices. Like, Frankl talks about the endless debates over how to ration their meager bread rations.
Oh, yeah. Those weren't just philosophical discussions. They were matters of life and death.
Eat it all at once and savor the momentary satisfaction, or try to make it last. It's incredible how, even in those dehumanizing conditions, they were still searching for ways to hold on to their humanity.
It's the small choices, isn't it? The things that allow you to feel like you still have some control over your own experience, even in the midst of utter chaos.
It's amazing. But you mentioned depersonalization as another phase, and I think this is where it really gets chilling.
It's dehumanization, really. Stripped of your name, your identity, reduced to a number.
Right, and he talks about the finger game. Can you tell us about that?
So Frankl describes an SS officer who would stand at the entrance of the work detail, and as each prisoner passed, he would casually point his finger either left or right.
Left or right, and that determined
Your fate. Left meant you were sent to work that day. Right meant the gas chambers.
Oh my God. So your entire existence, your future, came down to the whim of an SS officer's finger. It's barbaric.
It's beyond cruel. And it created this constant, pervasive anxiety. Frankl describes each morning as the most ghastly moment.
Because they didn't know if they'd make it through the day.
Exactly. Imagine waking up to that every single day. The sound of those whistles, the knowledge that you could be selected for death at any moment.
It's just unfathomable. But even in those ghastly moments, Frankl finds these glimmers of hope, these tiny sparks of beauty or connection that somehow manage to survive even in the darkness of the camps.
They're like these little candles flickering in the darkness,
Yeah, I get that. So tell me about some of these glimmers. What do they look like?
Well, one of the things that always gets to me is how they found ways to create beauty, even in that horrific environment. Frankl talks about these impromptu cabaret evenings they'd organize.
Cabaret in a concentration camp.
I know, it's hard to imagine. But they'd gather in a hut, find any excuse to laugh, to share stories. One prisoner even sang Italian arias in exchange for extra soup.
It's incredible.
It really is. And these acts of kindness, these moments of grace, they weren't just limited to the prisoners either. Frankl mentions an SS commander who actually acted with humanity after liberation.
Yeah, an SS officer.
That's a jarring contrast, right. But this particular commander supervised the collection of clothing for the liberated prisoners from nearby towns.
Wow. It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, even within a system designed to strip people of their humanity, there are still glimmers of hope, of compassion.
Exactly. And that speaks to Frankl's broader point, which is that even in the face of unimaginable suffering, we still have a choice. We can choose how we respond, how we find meaning in the midst of it all.
And that choice, that freedom to find meaning, is really at the heart of logotherapy, isn't it?
Absolutely. Logotherapy isn't about telling people what their meaning should be. It's about empowering them to discover it for themselves.
So how does that actually work? What are some of the techniques or principles of logotherapy?
Well, Frankl talks about three main avenues for finding meaning. The first is creating something meaningful, whether it's through work, art, or any other form of self-expression.
Okay, so finding purpose in what you create. What's the second avenue?
The second is experiencing something or connecting deeply with someone, like truly being present in a moment, appreciating beauty, or cultivating loving relationships.
So finding meaning in love, in connection, in experiencing the world around us.
Exactly. And then the third avenue is a bit more challenging, but it's incredibly powerful.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
It's about finding meaning in the face of unavoidable suffering.
That's a tough one. How do you even begin to do that?
Well, it's not about pretending the suffering isn't there or trying to rationalize it away. It's about choosing your attitude in the face of it. It's about finding a way to grow, to learn, even to find purpose, despite the pain.
That takes incredible strength.
It does. But Frankl would argue that we all have that strength within us. It's about tapping into it, about recognizing that even in the darkest of times, we still have the freedom to choose our response.
And he would know, wouldn't he, having lived through the horrors of the Holocaust?
Exactly. And, one of the techniques he developed to help people find meaning in difficult situations is called paradoxical intention.
Paradoxical intention, I've heard of that. Doesn't that involve doing the opposite of what you'd normally do?
It does. It's about leaning into your fear, almost like calling its bluff. He gives an example of a doctor who suffered from a debilitating sweating phobia.
Oh.
Instead of trying to avoid sweating, Frankl actually encouraged him to try to sweat as much as possible in social situations.
Wait, really?
Yeah. And you know what? It worked. By intending the very thing he feared, the doctor actually broke the cycle of anxiety. It's like he took away the power that fear had over him.
That's amazing. So it's about changing your perspective, shifting your focus.
Exactly. And that's something we can all apply to our own lives, even if we're not facing anything as extreme as what Frankl and his fellow prisoners endured.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up our deep dive into man's search for meaning, what's the biggest takeaway you hope our listeners will glean from Frankl's story?
You know, for me, it's the reminder that we all have the capacity for incredible resilience. Even in the face of suffering, we have a choice. We can choose to search for meaning, to connect with something larger than ourselves, to live a life that reflects our values, even when it's hard.
It's a powerful message, and I think it's one that's more relevant now than ever. So to our listeners, if you're looking for a book that will challenge you, inspire you, and stay with you long after you finish reading it, pick up a copy of Man's Search for Meaning. You won't regret it.
I second that.
And on that note, we'll leave you with this. If Frankl could find meaning in a concentration camp, what untapped sources of meaning might be hidden within your own everyday life? It's something to think about. Until next time, keep diving deep.